Somewhere in the world is a deep and dark forest hidden in a range of long forgotten mountains. At the edge of the forest is a narrow valley with a village, and nearby an upper meadow. In the meadow is a large, ancient house made of wood and stone, covered with carvings of animals and plants, both inside and out. Full of unexpected corners, crooked hallways and musty rooms, it is in many ways more like a cluster of caves than a house. Its weather-beaten door opens onto a path which forks into two, the first of which is wide, well-worn, and leads down to the village. The second path, so narrow and overgrown that it's barely there, twists around behind the back and leads into the forest. In this house lived a girl, her 3 younger brothers, their nanny, and the cook. The children were not allowed to go into the woods. No one went into the woods. Legend had it that they were haunted and dangerous. Several years ago, the children's parents had disappeared. An alarm had been sent out and everyone had searched for them, lighting torches and going all over the valley and the other valleys beyond, even to the very edges of the wood. It was thought that they might have entered the forest, but no one had been brave enough to pass the line of the first few trees to look. Uneasy whispers passed from servant to servant. The family was old, older than the village. No one really knew where they had come from, and they had always been slightly odd. Grandmothers from the village remembered their grandmothers talking in mysterious tones about the family in the ancient house. Most of the staff became spooked and left. Only Nanny and the cook stayed. Nanny stayed because she was fond of the children and felt that they needed her, especially in the strange emptiness of the old place. She was often tired, but the library held extraordinary treasures, and every day she looked forward to spending her evening discovering great books in peaceful silence after the boys had gone to bed. Cook stayed because he had never really been interested in what went on outside the kitchens. There were 2 or 3 of them, and they were always in full use despite the fact that only 6 people lived there. He was constantly sampling the extensive whiskey and wine collection and creating new dishes. Time passed. The girl missed her parents dreadfully. Before, when they were all together, there had always been guests, lively conversation, laughter, games, stories, and song. The boys were too young to remember. And in a way, with all the extra household chores to do, endless lessons to learn, and quizzes to study for, Nanny's quizzes could be quite hard. The daily routine had found a new normal. There were times when she wondered if her life would always be the same, just pottering around the house and visiting the village every so often. She had a music room to herself, though, where she happily composed and sang eccentric atonal songs in her free time. Most days she would take an hour or so to play hide and seek, tag, or explorers with her brothers. Sometimes they would all sneak down to the kitchens and nose around in what Cook was preparing, snatching any tidbits they could get their hands on before he chased them out. They knew every corner of the house and had even discovered a small door at the end of the lowest cellar. It was locked and never budged, no matter how hard they pushed or pulled. On occasion, they would sit down in front of it and enjoy their stolen snacks from the kitchen, imagining what was on the other side. They kept it secret and never told Nanny or Cook about it. One morning, the boys were running and jumping all over everything. As big as the house was, they somehow managed to be everywhere at once. Lately, they had become rather wild, and sometimes it was just too much. Their older sister was desperate to get out and have her own space for a while. She went out the old carved door and soaked in the fresh breeze that carried hints of pine, beech, and hazel. Closing the gate behind her, she started down the village path. After only a few steps, she heard a soft sound. She stopped and looked around. No one was there, but she was sure she had heard something. She listened again and slowly moved in the direction of the forest path. There it was a third time. A tiny, soft sound of laughter or song. She couldn't be sure which. A sudden shiver shot right up through her body. Forgetting about the village, she stepped onto the forest path. Everyone feared the forest because it was unknown. Perhaps she should get to know it just a bit. Turning her head to make sure no one was watching, she approached the first few trees that everyone was so afraid to pass. She took a moment to stop for a few deep breaths, and then, while letting the last one go, entered the woods. The forest was cool and shady. There were patches of sunlight darting through leaves and branches, lighting the moss-covered floor. Bunches of ferns were growing everywhere. A butterfly flew past, and she could hear the rushing of a stream somewhere nearby. The trees seemed to welcome and make way for her. Happy bird song filled the canopy above, and she knew animals were watching. They were the ones that were carved into her house. Following the path as it wound deeper in, she caught glimpses of bluebells growing on the forest floor. Each curve was more enchanting than the one before, and the air was full of, well, she didn't know what it was, but her heart felt so light and so free. There was nothing more beautiful than this place. After a few more twists and turns in the trail, she came upon an ancient stone well. It looked like something out of a fairy tale. Deciding it was time for a little break, she drew up some water. As soon as the first few drops touched her lips, she was overcome with delight. It wasn't like the water at home. It was colder, clearer, fresher. Relaxed and content, she yawned, feeling the need for a nap coming on. She looked around to find that hidden just behind some ferns was an entrance to a small cave. After checking inside to make sure there were no signs anyone was already living in it, she curled up on the ground and fell fast asleep to dream strange, vivid dreams of singing animals and dancing trees. Eventually, she woke. She crawled out through the ferns to discover that it was dark. The sun must have set hours ago, but no matter. Nanny thought she had gone to the village, and no one in the village knew she had planned to visit in the first place. She felt no fear. Despite the dark, the winding path was easy to see. She didn't stumble and felt as though she could hear everything that was going on in the forest. Hunting, eating, playing, and the faintest hint of music coming from somewhere. A burst of joy filled her, and she began to run. Before long, she was out of the trees and back in front of the house. All the lights were out and everything was silent. She quietly slipped through the old carved door and darted up a twisty staircase, then down the crooked hallway that led to her room. Once inside, she lit a candle. Glancing in the mirror, she had the shock of her life. In the soft light, her face was different. She couldn't say how, but it wasn't the same. She looked closer. Her eyes had an amber glow, and her ears were now 2 large furry red triangles on top of her head. Her body felt like it wanted to stretch and shrink at the same time, and there was a big, fluffy tail waving from behind her. She had a tail. She was turning into a fox. It must have been the bewilderment of it all, because instead of panicking, she giggled to herself. As strange as it seems, she couldn't have been happier. She trotted to the window and saw the moon shining down onto the roof of the house and the tops of the forest trees. 1,000 questions flooded her mind at once. Is this what had happened to her parents? Had they gone into the forest and drunk from the well? Was she going to be like this forever? If so, she didn't fancy the thought of being cooped up in the house. She wanted to be outside, in the woods. She thought of her brothers. If she didn't stay in the house, she couldn't just leave them behind and start a new life in the forest, could she? It wouldn't be fair to them, and she would miss them too much. What should she do? She thought of Nanny and Cook. Nanny was almost more interested in the library than the children, and she couldn't remember the last time Cook had invited them into the kitchen instead of chasing them out. She had to make a choice and suspected she didn't have much time. She decided to go with her gut. She crept back downstairs and out the door as quietly as she could. Her body was changing. She felt less human by the minute and knew she must hurry to be able to finish her plan. Racing up the forest path underneath the moon and the trees, she went back to the well. She filled the bucket with water, untied it, and carried it carefully back home. Arriving at the carved door and slipping inside again, she crept up to the boys' room. She saw that they were all curled up, sleeping peacefully in their bed. Nanny, with a book in her chair, had nodded off by the fireplace. She took the boys' water glasses from the bedside table, filled them from the bucket, and put them back without spilling a drop. She knew they were always thirsty at night and would drink up by morning. All she needed to do then was to wait. She settled herself on the floor at the foot of the bed and, despite her excitement, fell asleep. Having completely transformed into a vixen by early the next morning, she awoke to see Nanny yelling and pointing at 3 little fox cubs staring back at her from the bed. The cubs looked at each other and again at Nanny. Then they looked at their sister and began to laugh and sing a little fox song while bounding around on their blankets. Since Nanny couldn't understand them, She thought they were howling and laughing at her. She looked at all 4 of the fox children, considered the events of the last few years, and decided she'd had enough. This was the very last straw. "All right," she said, "out with you. And I'm leaving too." The children were a little surprised, but agreed amongst themselves that it was probably for the best, for now anyway. So, while Nanny packed her things, they ran through all their favorite nooks and crannies in the house and down to the kitchens to say goodbye to Cook. Not long after that, 4 young foxes trotted out the old carved door, followed by Nanny with her bag. Cook was happy to remain. For quite some time, he'd been thinking that the house might do well as an upmarket bed and breakfast for people who like to stay in old places with odd stories. Nanny strode down the village path, turning once to wave a thoughtful farewell. To be honest, she was relieved. It wasn't that she didn't like children, she was simply burned out. She planned on taking a good long holiday and then earning loads of money by becoming a specialist on antiquated books and dealing with overly rambunctious children. The fox sister and brothers returned Nanny's wave with their tails. They looked at each other, smiled, and ran happily into the forest. The end. Epilogue. As far as I know, the village and house still exist wherever they may be. I believe that the cook did indeed turn the house into a bed and breakfast for a while, but when strange things began to happen again, no one wanted to stay anymore. The young foxes might have found out what had happened to their parents, but that may be another story for another time. Also, it's possible that there's more about the locked cellar door.